Yeah, hi everyone. This is my first Netnod event, and I'm very happy to be here. As mentioned, yes, I'm responsible for all sustainability-related activities and processes within the company, and I thought it could be interesting to have a bit of an overview about sustainability, since it's becoming kind of like a bit of a buzzword, but I wanted to approach it from a bit different perspective. So what I'm aiming to do is give a bit of a bird's eye view of the topic and what everyone can do or how it affects everyone, as we believe that this is important or could be interesting information for everyone sitting here. So yes, a bit of a brief overview. So I want to cover what's the relevance for the industry, so how are we impacted, some terminology. So there's a lot of buzzwords flying around. What exactly do we mean by specific terms, and then how you could go to the road to net zero. So one of the words that's also being mentioned a lot. So what do we think that are the main pillars, and what are the important steps that you could take? And then the main pillars of a sustainable strategy based on our learnings of the last 1 year. So yes, as I also mentioned, this topic is quite relevant for the industry. There's a lot of articles appearing. There's a lot of statements about us having to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But what exactly are these in numbers? So it's predicted that the electricity usage of the ICT industry can be rise up to 20% or 20.9% by 2030 globally. So this is quite a big chunk. And also traffic is growing exponentially, and it has been for the last decades, and it's expected to do so and continue so. So this is a heavily impacted industry we're talking about. So what we see right now, there's a big variety based on where everyone stands regarding sustainability. So wide range of commitment goals. It ranges from none to becoming carbon neutral or net zero by 2030, 2040, 2050. There's also a wide range of variety of reportings available. Some companies have reportings going back to years. And they've been looking at their emissions already. And there are some companies where the word sustainability is pretty tricky to find on the website. Regardless, there is an uptick in interest and knowledge, what we've been seeing overall. And there's also a lot of associations dedicated to the topic where several companies can go and volunteer their time or be part of a community where multiple companies work towards a similar goal, making this industry more sustainable. So why is it becoming more and more of a focus of attention? There are several shifts in the market right now, starting with regulatory changes, also pushed by the European Union. There's also consumer pressure because some of the regulations, consumers are also becoming more conscious in choosing their suppliers. They're also ready to switch, and there's also a higher likelihood of acquiring them if you have sustainability-related strategies. Also, there are some statistics about investors are more likely to invest if you have a sustainable strategy in place, and it can also help with talent acquisition as employees are more conscious about the values of the companies they're joining. And next to this, as also a good side effect, once you have a sustainable strategy in place, your company value also increases. So just to name a few of the regulations to put out there, there's the EU taxonomy. Part of it is already passed, but it's also a gradually implemented. I'll talk a bit more about it later. The CSRD, I'll also mention a bit more details later. EU supply chain law and the national climate regulations. So Germany, where we're also based, is also a good example for that. So recently they announced that there will be a new regulation about supply chain due diligence, which has a lot of companies right now in frenzy. And all of this is kind of powered by the EU Green Deal, which was made or passed in 2019. And since then, the European Union is putting a lot of investment money and time into pushing more transparency and more sustainability across all industries. So these are only a few regulations. There's way more of them, also more upcoming, and it's expected to grow. Just to have a bit of closer look, why this can be relevant for everyone. So the EU taxonomy, this applies to companies who have more than 500 employees or work in the financial market. And this is already partially applied. I was in January 2022, but most of it will come into force in January 2023. And this kind of sets or defines whether a company is environmentally friendly in its operations. So based on 6 environmental objects, which amongst them are pollution or focus on becoming a circular economy or being conscious about climate action. And you can be defined to be environmentally friendly if you commit specifically to one of these objects and not go against and not significantly harm the others. And there's the CSRD, Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive. This is still in draft phase, but is expected to be passed by end of this year. And this impacts even more companies. So approximately 49,000 companies in Europe. So if they're based in it or operating in it, this is pretty important for companies. And this means that these companies will have to report or have a sustainability report in place for the financial year of 2023. So the first reporting will have to be made by April 2024. And it's definitely something interesting to look into to kind of take the curve ahead and be ready when that comes, as this requires some additional reporting standards and details, and companies will have to be audited by third parties. So yes, that's all nice and good to know, but where do we actually start? So I would like to start with defining some of the phrases. So carbon neutrality and net zero emissions, these are 2 words that are kind of like to be used interchangeably, whereas they're not. So carbon neutrality refers to all the carbon emissions that a company makes during their operations. And that is offset by the company by various investments into carbon sinks, which can be, for example, also planting trees. So these carbon sinks are oceans and forests, for example. And net zero is already including all greenhouse gases, so not only carbon. And it also aims to reduce these emissions to the smallest amount possible. So there are some emissions you cannot avoid just from the basics of operating a company, but there's a lot you can cut down on. So reach this minimum, and then the rest should ideally be kind of absorbed by nature, or if it cannot be, then kind of also offset it in a similar way. Just to also visualize it a bit, so carbon neutral would be continuing with the business as usual status, and then offsetting everything that's in the blue and gray area by specific investments. Obviously, even if you do the offsetting, you would like to reduce your emissions because investments, that has money involved. So the lower your emissions, the less you have to compensate. And then net zero, as you can see, once you have your measurements, you really try to decrease the emissions to the absolute minimum. And then at that point, you can, so like this happens through renewable energy, changing light bulbs, and flying less, and all the possible more traditional approaches. And then once you reach net zero, then emphasis on net, so counterbalancing. And then on the long run, hopefully, you will have less emissions than is counterbalanced, in which point you reach the environmentally positive state that is kind of desired. And the net zero is right now is at 2050. That's also based on the Paris Agreement, where they scientifically defined that that's the end goal for net zero that we have to reach in order to not have a higher warming than 1.5 Celsius, which would have crucial effects on the environment and for the planet as well. So yes, but what exactly are emissions? So let's dive a bit deeper. There are 3 specific scopes that we can measure. These are defined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Scope 1 is directly connected to the company, so the owned assets and what are the emissions coming from it, whereas Scope 2 and 3 are indirect emissions. So Scope 2 is related to the purchased and used energy by the company, and Scope 3 is usually the largest amount. So most of the companies would be surprised by this if you haven't already mapped this. Scope 3 can get up to 70 to 90% of the emissions of a company, and this is often unaccounted for. So this is so large because it covers the whole value chain, the whole supply chain, all these indirect emissions that come from suppliers. Just to break it down a bit more, why is this so big? So as you can see, Scope 3 can be divided into 2 categories. So there's upstream activities and downstream activities, and they're all the subcategories that you have to account for. So on this graph, we can also see that this is so much more than just the electricity usage that is often discussed within this industry. It's a quite complex and comprehensive issue, and it's a very thorough measurement that you have to make to have everything transparent within your organization. So after seeing this and looking at this graph that you've probably seen already quite a few times, we have a very interconnected and collaborative industry. So our Scope 3 emissions theoretically would be the highest also for everyone. And because of this, the true change can only be made if everyone is conscious about these decisions. So because indirectly you are affecting someone else's emissions. So in the end, you can start to move on your own, but in the end what I would say, it's really important to collaborate. There are all these players, there's even more of them, but there's a huge variety, and everyone, if everyone acts, then that's when the big change happens. Yes, so road to net zero, how does that actually happen? We established, or like there's 5 specific points that you should go through on the road to becoming net zero. So first, monitoring, you should be aware or like collect the data. Reporting, report the data, set the reduction targets. So how do you want to decrease these emissions once you have an idea about it? Validate it, depending on size. Most of the companies will have to audit this data by third parties, but if not, it can be also interesting to look into it. And then requiring and getting the certifications to prove also to the outside world how you're doing. However, what we also found that looking at this process backwards from like top to bottom helps a lot in getting the bigger picture and avoiding some mistakes or overseeing some things on the go. So if you look at the certifications, in our case, these were the ones that we looked at. There's so much more, so it's worth to look into it. But for us, first of all, the B Corp certificate allows us to cover a lot of operational areas, so the governments, the workers, environment, community. So it's not just focusing on the emissions per se, but the whole company to operate in a sustainable way. The SME Climate Hub, this is really nice when you're at the beginning of your journey. So this is for small and medium enterprises, but if you're beginning at your sustainability journey, it has an information hub and some digital courses which summarize the whole journey in a very nice way. And with this, you can also join the UN Race to Zero, which also sounds quite nice. And then there's also the ISO certificates. These often prove whether you have some processes in place and whether you have them right in place or conforming way. And there's 1% for the planet. This is more like a philanthropic activity where you can create a positive environmental impact with your donation. As I mentioned, there's way more, but we have been focusing on these specifically in the last year. Then validation. So why is this good to look at it even if you don't have to do it? Because there are, with this you can identify the key players and stakeholders who you turn to, who's going to help you with it, or who do you have to report to. You can also look at the processes. How will you collect the data, and where do you get it from? Where does the industry stand right now? Also, define clear measurable KPIs upfront, and get familiar with the ESG reporting and disclosure platforms that you can use. What are the benefits of this? You can set a good strategy ahead. You can also increase transparency also for your customers, suppliers, employers, and you become compliant with regulations and reporting standards, which is pretty important, and being aware of all the risks and costs of non-compliance. So reduction targets, this is a point which is very important or interesting to revisit again once you have monitoring and reporting in place. But it can also get benefit to look at it and plan ahead, even if you don't have the exact and specific data at hand. But it's definitely recommended to revisit after. Because with this, you can set your target up front. When do you want to be net zero? When do you want to be carbon neutral? Science-based targets. As well as you can align with management and communicate your goals, which will help them with making more conscious choices when signing suppliers or working, same for employees, and communication. Once you know that you will have some results, which will potentially not be around zero, you will have to make some changes if you want to reduce these emissions, which will require some transformation. So if you communicate this up front, this transition will be a lot smoother because everyone will be aware of these already coming. And then the reporting. Some might have already heard of the term ESG reporting. This covers environmental, social, and governance. So this covers several aspects beyond just emission measurements. It also looks at worker rights, business ethics, and all those topics above. But what a lot of people don't talk about is that there's a lot of these frameworks out there. So how do you actually choose and where do you start? So if you actually start to dive deep into all the types of reportings, it's very easy to get lost in it. So there are 4 main areas that is recommended to look at. The industry, what are the industry standards? Then the geography, the legal requirements and regulations might vary across countries or even within the countries. Company type, do you sell goods or services or maybe even both? In these cases, what you choose also might change or what might fit you best. And then the stakeholders, why exactly are you creating this report? So who do you make it for? Who are the who's going to read it? So there's 3 bigger groups. It can be either for investors, management, or government. Sometimes you can even use more or combine them to make sure that you cover good ground. But there's a great variety of them, so recommended to look into it in advance. And yes, the rule of the 4C. So this is recommended when doing reporting. Be concise, so be to the point. You want people to read it, not to be too long with your text. Be consistent, so you also get to repeat the report because that's why you can compare to previous years and see your actual progress. Also, use current data or focus on current data. You can look for data in the past, but you cannot really make decisions or most up-to-date decisions based on past data. You should look at the most current one and then make it comparable. So this is why we use the frameworks, because this way you can benchmark yourself to other industry players. So you know kind of where you progress and where others are. And most importantly, make sure that all the data that you put in there is verifiable, that you know where it comes from, as you might have to answer that question later. Reporting, yes, so there's multiple ways to do it. Both of them have their pros and cons, internal and external. So once internally, an internal software could be recommended if you don't want to do it manually, and could be done by the sustainability manager or staff or team, depending on company size. And also, if you're maybe in a bigger rush, you can use also external sources, for example, consultancies and partners who would make sure that you get it done fast. However, if you would want to report more than once a year, it might be beneficial to kind of set processes in place within the company so that you can repeat it without spending a lot of time and money with always getting external assistance. And then these three are the most well-known and used frameworks. If you're interested, I highly recommend to look into all three of these. These give some pretty good idea about the topic and the reporting types. And then monitoring, last but not least. So there's already several monitoring softwares out there. There's just a few of these. This is a not limited topic. They help you to organize your data. So once you give them the data, they create the report for you, and then you know your emissions, and they also calculate based on the scopes. They follow regulations. For us, what you might also want to look into, for us, these 4 points were very important. So to have automated solution, have an easy integration, as we wanted to have it internally, have regular software updates, and be able to set targets. We wanted the software to have the possibility to set science-based targets for us, so we do not have to make the calculations. And if you're already at the point where you decide to reduce your emissions, one thing that you would be interesting to look into is the carbon market, because these are some companies, just a few of them. For an example, there are marketplaces and offset providers already operating and making sure that once you know the emission numbers, then you can offset your carbon emissions. So what we've seen in the last year, that there are 4 very important pillars of building a sustainable strategy. So it's important to be supported from top to bottom, also to have leadership that pushes the initiative, and have a company structure that supports also, so a good governance structure. Expertise. Someone has to be responsible and accountable for all this. So if you have internal experts or hire sustainability officers, that can be quite crucial in reaching the deadlines and having a good overview and internal communication within the company. Collaboration, I mentioned already before why I find it important, but also it's important to have it within the industry, but also externally. Everyone has a similar goal, so there's a lot of valuable information to be exchanged. And communication, internally and externally, it's very good that if everyone is on the same level with sustainability knowledge, not just the sustainability officer and not just top management, but everyone who's involved in the company, because that way sustainability can be part of everyday business operations, and it's just not a buzzword on the website or within the company that you hear a few times. And yes, so we also practice what we preach. We're currently at the point of having our carbon measurements and planning to offset them soon. And we have some specific goals ahead in the road. I would highlight 3 of them. So by 2023, we would like to be B Corp certified, as well as have the ability or have the calculations in place that we share the emission data of all our customers. So every customer of us would know what their emissions are by using our services. And then by 2025, our goal is to become net zero. And that's what we're working towards right now. And yes, that was it from my side. And happy to answer any questions you might have.
We have a question coming over Menti.
Yes.
So many telco operators are divesting their radio network and selling their radio sites into tower companies. Does that allow these operators to claim a significant scope 1 and scope reduction and then leave scope 3 for later?
Well, whatever you do not do in-house becomes scope 3. So once you outsource it, it becomes part of your supply chain. And if there is a company that can do it more sustainably than you do, then yes, go ahead. But if this is just a way to avoid being accountable for scope 1 and 2 because you want to deal with that first, then I don't think that is the solution. Yeah.
It's probably a solution for that company until someone calls them on it.
Yes.
Any other question for Nicol? Okay, then please join me in thanking Nicol for a very nice presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.